Aside from those more obvious considerations touching Moby-Dick, which could not but occasionally awaken in any man's soul some alarm, there was another thought, or rather vague, nameless horror concerning him, which at times, by its intensity, completely overpowered all the rest. And yet so mystical and well-nigh ineffable was it, that I almost despair of putting it in a comprehensible form. It was the whiteness of the whale that above all things appalled me. But how can I hope to explain myself here, and yet, in some dim, random way, explain myself I must, else all these chapters might be naught.
Welcome to PequodPod, the podcast on the wonder world of Herman Melville. I am your host, Tristan Bavel-Marquise, and today we are welcoming Naima Karczmar to the pod. Would you please tell us a bit about yourself, Naima?
Hello, I'm so happy to be here. My name's Naima. I'm a PhD candidate in English and Critical Theory at UC Berkeley, and I work on Melville as part of my broader research on racialization and kind of the earlier periods of American colonization.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm very interested in how you first became interested in Melville.
Oh, that's a great question. I have such a boring answer, which is that it was on my qualifying exam for the American 19th century. The reason I became fascinated was because, as I said, I work on like race and racialization. And when I was reading Moby-Dick for the first time, and Benito, Cereno, one of his short stories, I was really, really struck by how weird and complicated his engagement with race was. You know, normally when you read an author from the early American 19th century, you're going to get either you're going to get like sentimental fiction, like Uncle Tom's Cabin or something like that. That's this sort of straightforward and kind of like simpering abolitionist text that is like, we should free the slaves out of the goodness of our hearts. Or you're going to get something really virulently racist, right? And Melville is really neither. He's really like interested in how it becomes possible to talk about somebody as having a race at all. And that makes for some really weird, complicated, interesting passages, particularly in a book like Moby-Dick, which is our the inauguration of what we would call encyclopedic fiction, right? Like this huge grappling with all sorts of knowledge that he's trying to bring into the page and represent in fiction. So the how I became interested, not very interesting. But I think the reason for my interest is maybe more fun to talk about.
Sure, yeah. And so that makes perfect sense. Now, I invited you onto the show because I found your article in the most recent edition of Leviathan very fascinating. And if any of our listeners don't know, Leviathan is a wonderful scholarly journal published by the Melville Society. Now, your article entitled Encyclopedic Raciality, Geo-Ethnographic Speculation, and Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. So you talked about it a bit, but what inspired you to write this particular article?
Yeah, this is an adaptation of a dissertation chapter of mine. Basically, I was curious about what happens in fiction that is trying to represent a racial subject, right? Like it has to, like the job of the fiction writer is to paint a picture for the reader. So what Melville is trying to do is to say, hey, there's this like cannibal savage that is really, really crucial to the story. And here are the words I'm going to use to describe this character. But he's also really skeptical of those same paradigms. So even as he is talking about Queequeg as this sort of uncivilized racial other, he's also spending a lot of time untangling like why we would think of this person as inferior or this perspective as inferior. And he does a lot of comparisons between the so-called cannibal and the sort of upright liberal Christian subject. And most of the time when he's doing those sort of hierarchical comparisons, actually the cannibals come out to be superior. So he inverts the typical hierarchy. So that was the starting point for the article. I was like, wow, this is really deeply critical of racial subjugation, and at the same time it's completely reliant on a stereotypical racial vocabulary. So how do we start to understand that dynamic? And it kind of spiraled out from there.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Continuing with Queequeg for a minute then. So in your article, you write of him as if he's sort of like a hodgepodge of different stereotypes of savagery, where you can't exactly place what ethnic or racial category he's supposed to be. Can you talk to us a little bit more about this aspect of Queequeg?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing that starts to happen with the rise of industrial capitalism. You also get abstraction, by which we mean like sort of generalization of racial categories as like part and parcel of the way those categories take shape. So like instead of having somebody from a specific place and a set of characteristics that you would associate with that place, you instead have something that is just like cannibal. There's no associated real world location. Critics will sometimes say Queequeg is Polynesian, which sure, possible, but there's nothing in the novel itself to support that. And that's actually like quite similar to the way that Blackness takes shape. Also around this time is you suddenly have this category of person that isn't associated with a particular religion, isn't associated with a particular location, and is only associated with either physiognomic or cultural characteristics. So in the case of Queequeg, what's interesting about that is that his race seems to just be cannibal. And there are all of these long passages about his skin color and about his savagery and about the possibility that he might become civilized. There are also long passages about his religious practices. But what Melville is doing is drawing from a sort of dizzying array of source texts, mostly European travel narratives, which are largely fiction anyway. But he's drawing from all of these source texts to create this sort of hodgepodge that goes into Queequeg's racial makeup, and that from the perspective of the novel is somewhat coherent because, again, he's a novelist. He's building a character that you have to sort of be able to reliably understand. But if you drill down into the specifics, none of these characteristics really make a ton of sense together. And so it's like he is drawing our attention to the absurdity of his source text and the absurdity of thinking about the world and other people this way. And at the same time, he's using all of those source texts to still maintain their legibility or their function as something that we can read, see, and think, yeah, that seems plausible, right? So Queequeg is a fascinating character to me for many reasons other than that one, but that's the first thing I would say.
Yeah, you get into the purplish yellowness of Queequeg's skin as sort of like a characteristic of this ambiguity.
Yeah, exactly. And like, what even is purplish yellow? Like, that's not even a color, right? Like, even if we were divorcing it from skin color, it would be very difficult to picture that out in the world. So yeah, it's just so profoundly strange and so interesting.
Wonderful. So at the core, so as far as I can tell, at the core of your argument is that Melville uses epistemology to destabilize racial capitalist ideology. Now, our audience is composed of very intelligent people, but would you be so kind as to break this down for us a bit? What is racial capitalist ideology? What is epistemology? And how can the latter destabilize the former?
Yeah, that's a great question. I myself don't totally know the answer. But basically, so if you talk to any Marxist, they're going to have opinions about what ideology means. It's a very sort of fraught, contested term. I make a slight distinction between the two terms that could be synonymous, epistemology and ideology, because I think that when you talk about epistemology, the very basic definition is what we know and how we know it. That's like that branch of philosophy. Ideology typically is like knowledge with an agenda. It's like how we function under capitalism. We look at something like value, we look at something like profit, we look at something like money, and to us it seems like that's a tangible thing that we can count on. In fact, totally irrational, right? And so money is the sort of paradigmatic example of an ideological thing that still has force in the world. So racial capitalist, you just add racial capitalist to that term ideology, which you can think of as knowledge with an agenda. Racial capitalist ideology is just this set of paradigms on which we operate that are designed to uphold all of the functions of capitalism, including racial hierarchy, right? Like race is really essential, especially to the establishment of American capitalism, because America is one of the nations in the world that is most economically reliant on plantation slavery. So in order for the entire economic edifice of this country to function, it needed racial hierarchy. Melville's epistemologies, okay, so maybe the first thing I'll say is that actually you can't, there's nothing you can say or like think or write that is actually gonna make a tangible dent in racial capitalism. That's not really how discourse works, in my opinion. Some people will disagree with me. But Melville is trying very, very hard to interrogate those paradigms. And he's using epistemology to do so. Epistemology just being like knowledge, right? So this is the encyclopedia. He's like, okay, so we have this thing that we're supposed to believe, this thing being racial hierarchy, and then we have all of the things that underpin it, all of these texts that these people have spent so much time writing, these travelogues, these aesthetic tracts, these encyclopedia entries. He spends a long time in phrenology, right? And skull shapes and bone structure, all of these various sets of quote unquote knowledge that have established themselves as knowledge that are supposedly serving as evidentiary bases for the function of race and racialization. But what Melville shows us is that if you model all of these things, all of these texts and all of these evidentiary practices together, they're completely incoherent. They make no sense, right? So that's the destabilization function.
Are you able to highlight some examples of Melville using epistemology in this way?
Yeah, for sure. My favorite is the part where he's talking about cetology, right? Like the study of whales. And there's this moment on page 390 of the text that I'm using, which not everybody has to use, but maybe you can hunt it down. He's talking about the sperm whale's back. And he refers to, when he's talking about the different categories of whales, there's this sort of like implicit comparison with the different categories of race and human beings. And sometimes the analogy also becomes explicit. So, for instance, when he talks about the sperm whale, its back is Ethiopian. I think that's just like self-evidently absurd. But also there's nothing stopping him from making that comparison. And in fact, it is also a comparison that shows up in a lot of earlier texts, where like somehow national categories, racial categories are associated with like the natural world. And this is an attempt to naturalize a social construct, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So that's one fun example. There are also all of those sections on phrenology where he's like talking about the shape of the whale's skull, and he's like, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something like he talks about a whale skull being like a black George Washington. And you can kind of feel him laughing every time he does this. He's like, look how ridiculous this is. I'm going to do it, but it is clearly a joke, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a sincerity to Melville, but he's very rarely serious.
Yeah.
He's
yeah, no, that's a great distinction.
Your article also refers to Melville's radical abolitionism, either him like having a radical abolitionism or there one being present in Moby-Dick. So what evidence do you see for this characterization of Melville as either having a radical abolitionism or potentially being a radical abolitionist?
Yeah, I think it's Benito Cereno, right? Like that would be the kind of most self-evident example. For those who don't know, Benito Cereno is a short story based on a real circumstance of a slave rebellion. And Melville writes this historical account in a very strange pseudo-Gothic kind of horror style. And basically what he does is he inhabits the white perspective, right? But he also demonstrates the ignorance of that perspective, because what ends up happening in that story is the captains of the slave ships look at their black servants and automatically think of them as lesser than, as stupid. And what that does is it opens the white men to complete and total manipulation by these black subjects, because they're obviously not stupid, but they know how the white man is perceiving them, and then they are able to use that to stage a rebellion. And Melville, I think, is very sympathetic to the slave revolt. In that text, but also in Moby-Dick, where every black character who enters that space is potentially a slave on land, right? We're still in that era. On the ship, there's no category of slavery. And I think that's very intentional. This disruption of structural hierarchy that at the time would have been conventional. He's very interested in making his black characters actual characters with agency and with lives. And in the case of Pip, with this sort of like epic tragic arc that has interiority and depth, and is just like deeply, deeply sad because Pip is stranded out on the ocean, goes mad, loses all of his brightness. But nowhere in that story is like Pip's status as a potential slave really vitally important to what goes on with his character. And I think that's very, very intentional, which isn't to say that Melville's not racist. I think he, like most men of his time, pretty clearly is. It's just that he is more deeply invested in disrupting hierarchy than a lot of his contemporaries.
No, that's fascinating. There's a number of things, another number of threads we could go off from that. To go back a few steps, I I think both in Benito Cereno and in Bartleby, you have sort of similar unreliable narrators or unreliable protagonists, if you will, who are these white men in positions of power who like fundamentally like don't understand something about the situation that they're in. And I think it's interesting. Like you could like looking at both those stories, one in the context of a slave revolt, and the other in the context of like the exploitation of, in this case, more closer to like white collar labor. I think they're both very interesting. I think it's interesting for him to use this like sort of unreliable narrator that kind of goes through like the thought processes and like has the same sort of blind spots as like the hegemonic force like in his civilization at the time.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, you bring up Bartleby, which is also a really interesting case. I mean, I think like, don't you think that is also very a very anti-capitalist piece of writing, even though he's like writing from the position of the bourgeois subject?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's I think it's sort of intentional in both regards, right? So like in both cases, like the character that's leading us through these encounters, like is that sort of bourgeois, like white male subject. And yeah, I think that's absolutely intentional. And the sort of idiocy of both of these characters, or like at least like the cultural blind spots that they have, or like class blind spots that they have, make them like kind of compelling and like make their like both of their critiques more incisive, I think.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah. And it's totally fascinating because we think of the novel, like in literary history, like the conventional narrative is like the novel is the form that invents or first represents in fiction the bourgeois subject. So like that's why people are obsessed with Robinson Crusoe, because it's like the first instance of us having like Homo economicus or like the capitalist. And it's really fascinating in Melville to have that also taking place as like kind of like an imminent critique, or as like an inhabitation of a subjectivity that he's like really clearly very critical of. Yeah, as you say, it's a really fascinating interplay.
So going back to another interesting thread that you brought up, so you forefront the chapter Midnight Forecastle as being especially important for understanding Moby-Dick as a whole. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, up until this point, I think a lot of things happen to the text. It changes in terms of its style, it changes in form, and it changes in genre. And it's also the moment where it goes from being interested in like a wide variety of raced subjects and others to being explicitly preoccupied with Blackness. And this is also the first moment where we don't have Ishmael as what we would call a focalizer. So like the gaze, the perspective through which the narrative is unfolding. That gets suspended because what happens in this chapter, as you know, and a lot of your listeners probably also know, is that it's a play. It's just dialogue. And it's modeling a storm, and it's also modeling the racial tensions between all of the sailors on the ship, all of whom are from different places. And you have this really interesting interplay between the sailors, the old Manx sailor, the Spanish sailor, the St. Jago's sailor, and the Nantucket sailor. And then you have Daggoo, who is a black harpooner. And he says, "Who's afraid of black's afraid of me." And then we have the Spanish sailor saying something very racist and then saying no offense. And Daggoo kind of saying none. And then eventually they provoke him into attacking. The way that race takes shape on the page here is like so significant to the unfolding of the narrative. I say in the article that Blackness is what transforms it into an epic, because we have an explicit Shakespearean allusion. We have the comparison between Dagu and Caliban, from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and we have this like very clear sense in which Dagu is actually, in fact, the hero of the play, and the white men emerge as these kind of idiotic instigators of racialized violence.
When I was rereading some of the relevant chapters to prepare for this interview, one of the things that struck me that hadn't struck me in the past is, so like in that encounter you're talking about between the Spanish sailor and Dagu, there's also another sailor who's written as being a Saint Iago sailor. And so I don't know if it had occurred to you before, or like to what extent this is intentionally done. But Iago obviously is the villain of Othello. Do you think this is like an intentional decision on Melville's part to make this sailor specifically a Saint Iago sailor in that sense?
Oh my God, that's so interesting. No, but you should write in and add that to the article. That had not occurred to me. Yeah, totally. I could totally see that. Iago is a Cape Verdean island, but it is also the name of the sort of sniveling instigator in Othello, and the driver of all evil. That's a really interesting parallel. Somebody should write that article. Maybe you.
Maybe me. Anyway, moving forward, so thinking about the chapter Midnight Forecastle.
We were talking about Pip before. Mm-hmm. So at the end of this chapter, you get this soliloquy from Pip. Mm-hmm. A very fascinating soliloquy. And this is the immediate context for the chapters Moby-Dick and then the whiteness of the whale. Now, what do you think is the significance of Pip's soliloquy being immediately before these two chapters?
I think that it's like the most moving and deeply tragic moment in this entire book, is this soliloquy where he's looking at the storm, and you have this comparison between the white squall, right, the actual literal white storm formation, and the white man and the white whale, and all of it is like completely terrifying to Pip, but this is where like the Shakespearean allusion continues, but he's sort of functioning like the fool does in Shakespeare, right, where like the fool will be next to a king and will be able to say the truths that nobody else on stage can get away with saying. And what Pip is saying in this moment, when you really parse it, is like, God has forsaken this little black boy who is standing here facing all of this whiteness, this like enormous, epic, terrifying whiteness that is threatening his very life, but also his soul. And you asked about the significance of this moment coming right before the chapters Moby-Dick and the whiteness of the whale. I think if you take that soliloquy, as I do, to be a kind of volta or turning point in the narrative, then you have to also understand that whiteness is not only a threat to the black subject, is not only devastating to a character like Pip, it's also it's also dangerous to everyone on board, including the white men themselves. It's this kind of thing that robs them of everything. And of course, at the very end, Ishmael is the only survivor, right? So I think the significance of this moment really can't be overstated if you're looking at race in this book.
Wonderful, thank you. So you state in the article that Moby-Dick is a fundamentally different kind of abolitionist text. Mm-hmm. Now, some members of our audience may be unfamiliar with what is typical of abolitionist literature contemporary with Melville. What is this typical abolitionist literature like, and what about Moby-Dick makes it distinct?
Yeah, I love that question because it lets me nerd out about my fields. Okay, so in the 18th century, abolitionism is taking place, sort of inaugurated by the slave narrative. I mean, like before Equiano's interesting narrative, which is the first that we think of as the first slave narrative. You have a bunch of like political tracks, and so like various white guys are making speeches, right? And they're like, hey, this is, this goes against God, or this goes against humanity, or this is unprincipled, or like maybe we could get rid of like a certain part of slavery. Like a big argument in the sort of earlier 18th century was, we don't have to completely abandon plantation slavery or already established slavery, but we could get rid of the slave trade, right? We could just stop kidnapping people from Africa. That might be cool. And then in the 19th century, when Melville is writing, plantation slavery is very firmly established, and so you get the rise of sentimental fiction. So you still have slave narratives as the obviously the driving force of abolitionism. This first-person autobiographical account of slavery's horrors, but you also have white writers like Harriet Beecher Stowe, and so the sentimental novel is really like what gains the most popularity around the Civil War. And that text typically is going to be something like, we are God-fearing, virtuous people, and as such, we should recognize that these Black people, however inferior and savage and uncivilized, they are still humans and they deserve our mercy and our love. And so it's this very like condescending kind of like Christian, morally coded narrative that people really latch onto and that is enormously successful. Melville isn't doing that, right? Melville, like, if anything, Christianity is under attack by Melville's writing. It's satirized pretty ruthlessly. He's also, like, not interested in being super sentimental about his abolitionism. It's just, like, his take on racial hierarchy is, like, this is self-evidently absurd. It doesn't make any sense. And also it's part and parcel of like capitalist hierarchy, which also is oppressive to literally everyone. It's not that like these slaves are these horrible, emaciated victims that are completely lacking in agency. It's like, no, they are suffering under capitalism, as are we all. And so it just doesn't make any logical sense to keep it intact as a political force. But that's the main difference, I think, is that it's just that Melville is really lacking in sentimentality about it.
Wonderful. Okay. So one of the most striking chapters for me from the perspective of race has always been Stubbs' supper and Stubbs' interactions with Pequod's unnamed black cook. How do you interpret this chapter?
This is really interesting. And I'm glad you brought it up. This is where, the Roanoke River is explicitly mentioned. So Stubb has this like, back and forth with the cook where, he's trying to get information from Stubb, like, where were you born? What nationality are you? What religion are you? And Stubb is kind of like, the cook is kind of resistant to this, but he's not being, well, he's kind of being intentionally like, fuck you, but he's also, it's just true that he doesn't have a birthplace. And this doesn't make any sense to Stubb at all. Like the cook's response to where were you born is in a ferry boat going over the Roanoke. And that's a significant allusion because Roanoke country, the Roanoke River in particular, was a route along the Underground Railroad. And it was a sort of famous conduit among slave watermen for spreading revolutionary ideology, and in particular spreading information about the Haitian Revolution. So the cook is very clearly an ex-slave and a fugitive. And what's kind of funny about this encounter is that Stubb has no framework for understanding any of what that means. It's entirely incumbent on the reader to see the word Roanoke and be like, oh, actually, yes, the cook must be have had a brush with slavery at some point, and must have also had a brush with its overthrow.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So fun autobiographical fact for the audience about me. So I was born in Roanoke, Virginia.
Oh my God!
And they put an extra syllable in there than you'd expect.
Okay.
It's like so it's inexplicably 3 syllables long. Roanoke.
Yeah.
But that's very fascinating. One of the things for me, Stubbs' character is undeniably very, very racist in this interaction, but you also get this resistance to this from the cook. What do you see in that?
It's kind of like a little bit of a wink on Melville's part, because Stubb doesn't exactly come off as like a sympathetic character. He has depth and humanity, like kind of every character. Melville doesn't really stage anyone as a so-called flat character, but we're not like really on his side during this interaction. He's very sort of tyrannical. He orders the servants around. And so it kind of reminds me of Benito Cereno, the way this plays out, the way that there's like a black servant character who is according to the person they're talking to, is inferior in every way and is kind of entirely flat. But actually, to the reader, when you're looking at this interaction, it's kind of self-evident that the white guy is really dumb, and the black character is the smart one and is kind of manipulating him or challenging him,
Absolutely. And specifically in this interaction of the two characters, the one that becomes likened to an animal, right, is Stubb, right? So, ongoing in this chapter is the voracious eating of these sharks, of the whale's carcass that's moored up against the ship. Basically, towards the end of that chapter, if I'm remembering correctly, the cook refers to Stubb as being Massa Shark.
Yeah,
right?
Totally. Yeah, that's great. You're totally right. It's Stubb that's animalistic here.
Wonderful. And continuing this theme of like talking about like animals. So you mentioned that race in the text stretches its referential field over both humans and objects. To what extent do you view animals, and chiefly whales, as being included in that spread?
I think they're very much included. I spent a while very nerdily like going through the cetology sections and counting the racial reference. Didn't make it into the article. Nobody wanted my like charts of
I want your
You
charts.
want my
Send them to
charts?
me.
Okay, I would be happy to. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's fascinated by cytology, and it's a sort of exhausting section to read, right? Like these this whale has these characteristics and migrates in these areas, and here's what we know, and here are all of the citations for how we know about this whale. But also in there are a lot of moments where the shape of this whale's head reminds us of this racial group, or the people he's citing also are natural philosophers who are writing about whales, and also have written scientific tracts about racial makeup. And they're using they're claiming the same sort of authority for both. So I think, I mean, it's not, I'm not going to go so far as to say that those sections are primarily about race. I think they're part of a broader project. But it's very clear if you read them closely that race makes its way into natural philosophy and science. It becomes part of these other supposedly empirical, supposedly objective knowledge paradigms. And so that's really fascinating.
No, that's totally right. And I think a lot of people who aren't as familiar get to the cetology sections and expect it's just kind of some dry scientific 19th century attempt at science or something like that, but they're really funny. And I think people don't realize this, and to a certain extent I view them as lampooning a lot of attempts at science from the time. So I encourage people to take a close look at them, and not to scoff too much at them.
Yeah, totally. They are satirical.
Wonderful. And then finally, before we let you go, what to you is the significance of the whiteness of the whale?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. But what I would say, that chapter, the whiteness of the whale, is a little bit similar to the cetology sections in that it's kind of meticulously going through every association we have with whiteness and being well, it's not about this. It's not about the beauty of the pearl, because that doesn't make any sense. But it's also about this other aesthetic principle, and it's also about races of men. And so the book is very fundamentally interested in whiteness, obviously on a conceptual level, and everything that it symbolizes and everything that it represents and everything it's associated with is kind of cataloged and subject to critique in that chapter. One thing I'll say, so there are a million things that a million critics have said about the fact that the whale is a white whale. What I've been thinking about lately is that it is typically, when we think about the beautiful and the sublime in aesthetic theory, sublimity is associated with terror. So that's why there are a lot of books on Melville's Sublime. Because it's this it's the human being confronting something beyond our comprehension, either because it's too big or because it's a threat to our lives. In traditional aesthetic theory, sublimity, that sense of terror, that visceral fear, is associated with blackness. So for someone like Edmund Burke, who is one of the forefathers of aesthetics, it is always darkness that is, and I can quote directly, by nature terrible. And in Melville, the ultimate sublime creature is in fact white. So that's just a very basic and very fundamental inversion of our typical chains of associative reasoning vis-a-vis whiteness and blackness and terror and sublimity. And I think that's on purpose. And I think that is really fascinating and really emblematic of the entire project.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Naima, and it's been a wonderful conversation. Audience, I highly encourage all of you to read Naima's article in Leviathan, Encyclopedic Raciality, Geo-Ethnographic Speculation, and Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. Naima, is there anything else you would like to share or plug for our audience?
Oh, no, I don't do anything. I just read my books. But this was a really fun conversation, and thank you so much, Tristan. And I'm really excited to listen to all of the other episodes of the podcast.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the PequodPod with Tristan Bavell-Marquis, Meg Fancher, and Johnny Wiles. You can support the show by visiting patreon.com/PequodPod, throw us a doubloon or two for some bonus content, and to help to keep the show going full sail. Thank you for listening, and until next time, call us the PequodPod.